about to start it. Here we go. Hello and welcome everyone to today's event with 192 Books and Paula Cooper Gallery. I am Evan, the manager at 192 Books, and I am really thrilled to be welcoming everyone today to this event where Seth Siegelaub, Better Read Than Dead, Writings and Interviews 1964 to 2013 from Conant Books and the Stitching Egress Foundation. This is a really incredible book. This was an anthology that Siegelaub had himself envisioned putting together, but sort of never had the time to arrange, busy as he was with all his work around the world. So now this one collection really allows all of us to view the breadth of his work, and you get writings, interviews, archival documents, and it's sort of this incredible summation of a career. Joining us today are three of the editors of the book, Marja, Bloem, Joe Melvin, and Lauren van Haaften-Schick, as well as Anthony Allen, the director of the Paula Cooper Gallery. You can get full biographical information on all our panelists right on this page below, but just as a quick introduction, I'll say that Marja Bloem is a curator and writer, currently the director of the Stitching Egress Foundation. Joe Melvin is a curator, writer, reader in fine art at the Chelsea College of Arts, University of the Arts London, and the director of the Barry Flanagan Estate. And Lauren van Haaften-Schick is an art historian and curator pursuing a PhD in the history of art at Cornell. She's currently a Smithsonian Institution pre-doctoral fellow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Right after today's discussion, there's going to be an audience Q&A. So if you have a question at any time, you can email us to the email address below. That's Evan, E-V-A-N, at 192books.com. And I will relay that question to the panel. So the earlier you ask a question, the better chance you're going to have to hear it later. So send them early, send them often. Whenever you think of a question, send it. Don't wait till the end. Now, without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Anthony Allen, who's going to be moderating today's event. I hope everyone enjoys.
Thanks, Evan, and thank you to our speakers, and thank you to everyone for joining us. It's a very exciting opportunity to revisit Seth Siegelaub's legacy and try and circumscribe someone who in many ways was uncircumscribable. He was a fascinating figure and also an elusive figure. He was central to the art that he championed, but he also operated from the margins. He was a gallerist, he was a publisher, an archivist, a bibliographer, a curator who exploded the notion of what an exhibition could be. It could be a book, it could be a conference, it could be an ad in the paper. You could call him a sociologist of the art world or an ethnographer of the art world in some ways. And what is clear is many of the projects that he was doing had never been done before. And in fact, I love the fact that one of your first interviews that you publish in the book, the interviewer starts with, well, I'm not clear on how to start this interview because I'm not clear on what you've been doing, which I love the bafflement that many people felt when approaching this figure. Above all, he seemed to have a superhuman, prodigious ability to collect, digest, organize, and circulate information. And it's something that you see throughout his career in all of his projects. And it made me suspect that it wasn't Al Gore who invented the internet, it was Seth Siegelaub, because it helped him do his work better. So I'm excited for this conversation and to sort of revisit the arc of his career with you. So let's start with Lauren and with a presentation of the book and the career of Seth.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anthony, for that great introduction. I'm just going to swap to share my screen with you all quickly. Come on. Okay, great. So first, we want to thank Paula Cooper Gallery and 192 Books for hosting this wonderful event, and to the many supporters of this project, the Terra Foundation for American Art, the College Art Association, and of course, those who knew and worked with Seth, especially Jack Wendler. We also want to thank our fellow editor, Sarah Martinetti, who is organizing events in Europe, the designer of the book, Mark Hollenstein, as well as Koenig Books and Artbook DAP. And of course, we are hoping that Lucy Lippard will be able to join us. So the presentation I'm about to give you covers Seth's work and introduces us to the book, but also shows some things about the intersections of their careers. So I want to double check. The slides are showing up good? Great, okay, thank you. So Seth Siegelaub is best known for his innovative conceptual art exhibitions and publications, but each of these projects and later endeavors were done in a collaborative spirit with the artists, critics, and curators he worked with, including, of course, Lucy Lippard. I'm going to highlight some key projects by Seth, and as we go, again, also point to the cross currents between their two works, their two careers. Before Siegelaub's conceptual art years, in 1964 to 66, he operated Seth Siegelaub Contemporary Art on 56th Street in Midtown Manhattan, which for a time featured rugs installed too, hinting towards his later textile collection. There he presented exhibitions in relatively traditional media, painting and sculpture, but also began to experiment with print and publicity, creating posters or booklets for his shows. But the day in, sort of day out work of a standard gallery didn't suit him. It also, frankly, wasn't very profitable, as Seth would often say. Eschewing traditional gallery structures from 1968 to 71, he developed 21 projects in easily circulatable media, where an exhibition's manifestation in print could be its primary format, or to use Seth's term, primary information. The Xerox book, co-published with Jack Wendler, was one of Siegelaub's first catalogs and first foray into the world of book distribution, as seen here in a letter to book distributors. And this is a page spread from our book. And this is the cover of the Xerox book on the right. Early on, Siegelaub was also an agile promoter of his projects and the artists he worked with, including Robert Barry, Douglas Hubler, Joseph Kosuth, Lawrence Weiner, and sort of termed Four Famous, but also many, many others. The four artists' works were presented in January 5-31, 1969, the influential catalog exhibition, where the works on view were, quote, secondary information, or just samples of how they could materialize, and the works as text listed in the catalog were their main form. This was illustrated in different ways by each artist. For example, Robert Barry's carrier wave works that simply filled the space in which they were installed with radio waves. This dematerialization, a term famously coined by Lippard and John Chandler, was prefaced in Barry's barely perceptible monofilament string installations, pictured here, of course, invisibly, strung from a collector's house. That fall, in fall 1968, a similar work had been installed at Paula Cooper Gallery's inaugural show, curated by Lippard, Robert Hewitt, and Ron Wolin, a benefit for the student peace movement. Siegelaub's next group exhibition, March 1969, or 1 month, was his first multi-sited exhibition or networked exhibition, in which 31 artists were asked to submit an idea for a work on each day of the month. And this is a draft letter, the invitation letter, listing Hannah Darbovin as one of the artists he was considering including in the show. Siegelaub also designed virtually all of his publications, as you can see his layout kit modeled here nicely on one of his, a Moroccan rug from his collection at his home. And he experimented with layouts and different forms of graphic communication. And here are some examples of artists' projects in March 1969, including Christine Kozlov's continuous recording and Barry Flanagan's very funny sort of retort to the terms of Seth's letter of invitation. So experimenting with communication networks in a different way was the Untitled exhibition at Simon Fraser University in May and June of 1969, including a long-distance phone call symposium between New York, Ottawa, and Burnaby, which is just outside Vancouver, where Simon Fraser University is. And the transcript of that phone call is one of the many texts published in our book for the very first time. And fittingly, of course, a lot of that discussion is just about how bad the connection is. Siegelaub and Lippard's life and careers became more interconnected, and Siegelaub coordinated the production and distribution of Lippard's first number shows catalogs for exhibitions in Seattle and Vancouver in late 1969 to 70. Each participating artist, as you see here, provided an idea for a work that would be executed on location and then was printed or reproduced on a note card for the catalog. And the way this worked is the cards could be reshuffled in any way anyone wanted, and you would get them in this manila envelope. And as much as this mantra of quick, cheap, and easy exhibitions was repeated by Seth, it's important to note that none of these shows were actually that cheap to produce, as the sort of very lengthy budget for these shows. These exhibitions also gave Siegelaub the opportunity to expand his role as a book distributor, for example, coordinating books for sale at the Seattle Pavilion. These activities soon grew into his big book distribution company and imprint, International General, with Lippard's number shows offered through its book list. And that's in the sort of second column from the left at the very top in the image. The two supported each other curatorially again in 1970 when Siegelaub was invited to curate a section of Studio International, for which he deferred his curatorial authorship to 6 other critics, including Lippard, who asked artists to provide a situation within which the next artist on the list is to work. Here, a joke by Barry on receiving instructions late, and then giving Kaltenbach instructions to, quote, make something that is completely open, direct, explicit, without any obscurity or ambiguity. And of course, Kaltenbach writes, expose yourself. I know, it's nice to remember that like so much of conceptual art is jokes too. In 1970, Siegelaub began questioning the politics of art, composing a private memoir reflecting on his activities and on the changing field. Separately, he began announcing to friends and family that he would soon leave it. That year, Lippard too began reflecting on her involvement in conceptual art and personal politics, finding feminism that summer and fall, and writing a conceptual novel, I See You Mean, at the same time Seth was writing his experimental memoirs. Both were involved in the Art Workers Coalition, and with Seth as a core organizer, 138 Prince Street, where they lived at the time, was a hub of activity. For Seth, that investment in artist rights culminated in the development of the Artist Reserve Rights Transfer and Sale Agreement, a contract for artists to use when selling their works that gave them ongoing rights, such as resale royalties. And here in the center, you see a copy of the second edition of the agreement, which was edited by Siegelaub's collaborator, the lawyer Robert Pajansky, which is stamped for political art documentation distribution, a collective of politically conscious artists and writers, which Lippard was a founding member of. Developed just after the contract, Siegelaub's never fully realized idea for an alternative public press and news network marks his heightened political interests away from art. And around the same time, Lippard collaboratively developed West East Bag, an underground newsletter network focused on advocating for women artists. In the next decades, as we know, Lippard became more invested in feminism as one site of the intersection of art and politics, producing numerous important essays on women artists and co-founding the journal Heresies. Siegelaub's investment in politics and print expanded too, but in a different direction, towards Marxist theories of communication, establishing the International Mass Media Research Center outside Paris in 1973, and amassing a library available to outside researchers, writing bibliographies on the topic, 2 of them pictured here. And there's the introduction for bibliography 4 and 5 is included in our book. And he also published 14 titles, including the anthologies Communication and Class Struggle with Armand Model Art, and the English translation of How to Read Donald Duck, Imperialist Ideology in the Disney Comic. And here, artist rights emerged again in the issue of copyright, and censorship too. When the book was being imported into the US, customs officials seized them, claiming the material might be pirated. So here's Siegelaub's explanation of this holdup of the copies of the book that was happening from US Customs, sent out to the IG mailing list, reproduced here. And you can see that's how the interviews appear in the book. Right next to it as transcriptions. In the late 80s, Siegelaub's interest moves to the history and labor of textile production and circulation, and Seth moves to Amsterdam. In 1997, Siegelaub published a major bibliography on the subject, for which he developed a cataloging system, as he did for the IMMRC. Lippard's interest shifted too, towards indigenous histories, archaeology, place, land use. Lippard moved to New Mexico. But these interests also circled back to art through projects like A Different War, Vietnam and Art, and Undermining, among many other books and texts where she's reevaluated land art in the context of issues like tourism and overdevelopment. And Seth too, in these years, was called back to re-enter art. In the early 90s, through the project The Context of Art, The Art of Context, in which numerous artists who had participated in major historical conceptual art shows were asked to reflect on the period. And also in a project for that was included in Art Basel in 2011, How is Art History Made? Sort of bearing this brilliant sequence of questions that I think really still kind of force us and encourage us to rethink just what we're doing in this field and the stakes of this field all the time. Siegelaub also returned to artist rights, working with lawyer and curator Danielle McLean to establish an art law resource center. And this is a recording of an excellent talk, which you can find on YouTube with Seth, Danielle McLean, and Paul Cooper. And in 2000, he started his foundation, the Stichting Ingres Foundation, to encompass all of his varied projects. And as Anthony, as you mentioned, in 1990, or as Evan mentioned too, he had even begun planning for a book of his writings and interviews, which is where, of course, the title for this book is borrowed. And in 2012, there were major exhibitions of Seth's textile collection at Raven Row in London. And here you can see some of the books in his collection, and some of the textiles and his cataloging system for the textiles on these sheets. And in 2015 and 2016, a career retrospective at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam was held that covered all facets of his career, from conceptual art to political publishing to textiles. And I will leave it there. Oh, Anthony, you're muted.
Here. Thank you so much, Lauren. That was a great entry into the topic and a great overview. So before we start, we have a lot to cover, but before we start, I want to say something about the book itself. It's a beautiful, beautiful object with a lot of facsimile reproductions of Seth's typewritten letters, which are so helpful that with his annotations, many previously unpublished documents. And it's a beautiful design also that seems very of a piece with Seth's approach and his thinking. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the design decisions that went into making this book.
Yeah, well, I'll say that one of the cues for the cover design is taken from Seth's memoirs, where he writes that he wants the cover, and this is an excerpt of the memoirs that's reprinted in the book too, where he writes that he wants just a plain gray cover, no frills, and to be anonymous. So the spine is blank, as you'll note, and it's just this sort of nice, sort of grayish, very plain, but still very Seth kind of cardboard cover. Yeah. And the archives, we did want to have some kind of materiality of the archives come through, because one of the nice jokes in a way, or like ironies about conceptual art, is that the archives for conceptual art exhibitions are like so thick compared to some others, because there's just so much paperwork that gets produced in this process. And Seth was a real keeper of everything. Marja, as you know very well, and Joe too, from spending time in the archives also.
At the same time, you also seem to have made a decision not to include too many images. For example, images of exhibitions or photographs of various sorts. Was that part of the conversation in terms of the design?
Well, I think it was a conscious decision, because at the same time when we started working on this book, we were also producing the catalogue of this retrospective at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. And a lot of the visual material is in there. And you have to make choices. And we really wanted this one to be a source book. So really concentrate on his writings and the interviews. And the fact that there are so many interviews tells also a lot about Seth's ideas about cooperation, or how certain things came into existence. Like he would always say that conceptual art was something which was the result of a group of people, that it was not just him doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And another thing that we were very mindful of during the process of selection and the actual design, the final design, was to find a way to incorporate the notion of the publication as an actual exhibition in itself. So to give a sense of the kind of the book serving in that function as a form of primary information, but as an exhibition. So, you know, to replicate that whole way of thinking, the look of the book as important as its feel, its weight, and the difference of colors of paper. Even though there aren't masses of different colors of paper, they sing out when you look through the text, and then you see the annotations, as you mentioned. And so, you know, we think of the huge amount of annotation that Seth did across these letters, revisions, and so on. And this comes through, this constant thinking, constant shifting.
As I said in the beginning, I think it's an invaluable resource, and it will be an invaluable resource for anyone doing research, not only on Seth, but on the entire period and on the emergence of conceptual art in general. I want to go back to something Marja touched upon just now, the fact that he was very paradoxical in the sense that he was both central to the emergence of conceptual art, but at the same time he often removed himself from the center and operated from the margins. He seemed to have been quite self-effacing, abhorring self-promotion, and really finding meaning in collaboration and in a community, in art as a community of ideas. And on that note, I just love the names that he came up with for the various projects that he did. Image, International General, Stichting Egress Foundation. There's a reproduction that was in the slideshow that Lauren did of the possible names for the foundation, for the Egress Foundation, which is fantastic because you have, you know, the Framework Foundation, the Groundwork Foundation, the Harvest Foundation, my personal favorite, the Underlying Foundation, the Institute Foundation, a nice redundancy here. And so I'm curious about how these names come about. What do they reveal about him, about his approach? The fact that they're these sort of all-encompassing, you know, international general names. Marja, since you were involved in the naming of the foundation, what were your memories about that?
I think International General is a very good example of how he was thinking, because it had to be international. Like, he was one of the first to publish all those early conceptual art catalogs in several languages. And it had to be general, meaning that everything is possible. There's no limit. You can do what you like, as long as you do it with, let's say, passion. And so the name Egress Foundation, which he in the end chose for his foundation, had to do with a story Carl Andre told him about this American circus, Barney. that the people were sort of walking around and sort of led to see different animals. And there was one sign which said to the egress, and people thought that they were going to see an egret, a white bird, but when they followed that sign, indeed, they were suddenly outside. And this tells you a lot about a sense of humor. And then when he was thinking about it, yes, the egress is like, again, an escape. Everything is possible. Never feel limited by circumstances or whatever. Just think it's all possible.
I also think of him as introducing a kind of research-based strand in the art world. And in a way, something like International General and Egress are the direct ancestors of an artistic project like Walid Raad's The Atlas Group. And in the Atlas Group, you have the same idea of I mean, of course, with Walid, it's a fictional archive of the Lebanese Civil War, fictional and historical, at least those terms are not mutually exclusive. But you have the same sort of anonymous name, group identity, vaguely corporate, and this kind of all-encompassing attempt of the Atlas. Would you agree with that?
Yes, in a certain way, definitely, yeah.
There's something quite humorous about this idea of everything and how to actually contain and frame everything, or give a parameter for everything which is always slipping away, always going to the egress, always not possible to pin down. And it's kind of implicit as well in the prevailing sense of humor, which was always present whenever one was with Seth. The humor would come to the fore, although he was in many ways, as we've said, self-effacing, on the margins, outside, removed, not big in the egotistical sense. But there's this notion of the humor slipping in when you actually don't expect it in terms of conversation. So you could be having a conversation about the names of different types of dishes, different types of puddings and foods. He would be writing it all down, and then this would feature in his archive, this list of names, this whole list of words, and come back and make you laugh again.
Yeah, one of the many collections that Seth amassed was one of jokes too, which is now actually a joke. There's a Seth Siegelaub joke book, which Marja edited, which is wonderful. But yeah, I just love this thread of humor too, and even going back to the institutions, just like a bit of a play on the idea of an institution and the formality of institutions. Like his emails would always be we instead of I, as if there's like a real staff behind the IMMRC or the textiles, and even but even in framing each of these projects as if they were a very, very official institution, when really the library was just sort of something in his home or something in a storage space, or kind of very ad hoc and accessible, like really kind of a play on what institutions can be.
Yes,
really
but
nice
at the same time, you have to say that those libraries were of world format. I mean, there is hardly, when I think about the, say, the political library, which is now the Institute of Social History of the University of Amsterdam, they were extremely pleased by getting such a complete library, because he covered everything. The same is with his textile bibliography, which he published, and later. I think the only one which sort of matches it is the Rotty Foundation Metropolitan in New York. So even if he had it at home, yes, he wanted to live with those books, because Seth was a real book lover, no doubt about it. And he saw the value of books for spreading ideas. So he was definitely super interested in it. But he really amassed it very focused.
And thousands and thousands.
And I think
yes.
Yeah. To draw out on the point of collaboration, he wanted to render these as accessible and as transparent as possible. So the most accessible form is the list form, and to distribute that as widely as possible, in this general sense, so that prior knowledge isn't necessary. It's just curiosity.
Mm-hmm. I love also in the book, something that comes through in the book is that he spent time thinking of the letterhead for all these enterprises, that International General, and they all had beautiful, letterhead and looked very official. So one of the first essays that you reproduced, or it's an unpublished essay, but a very important one, called The Role of the Frame, and it introduces a lifelong concern of Seth's about the context as opposed to the art, and sort of shifting the lens onto what surrounds the art, the systems of value, the systems of power that underpin the creation of art. And Joe, I wondered if you could say a little more about this essay and whether Siegelaub was the first to shift the focus this way to the frame, if not, where did it come from?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting and very important essay that we haven't seen in full in this, and only now in this reproduction in this book, and it identifies a critical moment of thinking about the total context, as you say. So the parameter for the situation of the work is as much the work as the work itself that's within the situation. And those parameters are defined by so many different variable circumstances, including the network of people, the conversations that enable that to take place. So one of the links that connected Seth Siegelaub so closely to the editor, the British editor Peter Townsend of Studio International, was this shared interest in putting people together. So in collaboration in a sense, from a self-effacing position. So not being out there, being on the edge of that parameter, of that frame, of that context, and then allowing what ensues to develop in itself. And this shared engagement is something that came through in Peter Townsend's very particular engagement with the Chinese industrial cooperatives during the period during the Second World War, and then after the Second World War, until foreigners had to leave China in the 50s, and that interest in the model of those collaborations and those cooperatives was something that Seth was very highly engaged with throughout, in all elements of his research interests, and everything was to come back to this notion of those collaborations and those conversations that enabled those decisions to be made. And they're all part of that work. And I mean, one of the things that I think, is a sort of almost like a peripheral and anecdotal relation to this idea of the frame is the places that these conversations actually happened. So different pubs, different restaurants, the street, the field, the exhibition place itself, and where one would be meeting, and what were the circumstances of those meetings. So those interests and those preoccupations are being clearly declared at that point in 1968 is very important. But as to whether Seth was the first, he was certainly the first to articulate it, and there are probably others articulating thoughts and sharing these thoughts and coming together in this milieu of exchange.
Mm-hmm. I think we have Lucy Lippard joining us. Wonderful to see you, Lucy.
Great.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Nice.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Lucy.
Well,
Hi, I'm sorry, but I got my shot and I stood in the freezing cold for an hour.
Oh my God.
Great to have you. Thanks for joining.
Yeah.
Go ahead with what you're doing.
Well, maybe this is something that you'll be interested in jumping into. So we were talking about the role of the frame and the role of the context as something that Seth Siegelaub was fascinated with and really felt was crucial to underline. And he leaves New York in the 70s. And Lauren, you talk about how he sort of devotes himself to the politics of art at that point. Was that a farewell to the art world and sort of a move into a political sphere of activity, or is it more complicated than that? What would you say?
Well, in the middle of 1970s, Seth kind of begins, and Lucy, you probably remember this. Seth kind of begins saying, I'm leaving the art world, and writes to other artists saying this, writes to his family saying this, and the previous year he had sort of said, I'm not a dealer anymore, I'm just an organizer. So this was kind of a progression of leaving one role, which then became kind of leaving the field formally anyway altogether, and certainly in that period, everyone's political activities really heightened that we've been talking about. So Lucy, in our slide introduction, one of the things that we pointed to was how in 1970, your interest really turned towards feminism as a real focus of your own political activity, in addition to anti-war activity and all this stuff was already going on. And Seth begins sort of thinking about the artist contract, and then thinking about a later project for an independent, what was called the Public Press and News Network, which was like an underground newspaper that was meant to critique the existent kind of like mass media press. And I'm sort of moving back and forth now, but I also want to note that in thinking about those parallels, one of the things that we noted, Lucy, was that you at that time too began working on West East Bag, and also thinking about kind of these other networks of communication and these sort of other sites for political work and art to intersect. Looping back to the question, the artist contract is, I see it very much as, and I think others would agree, it's very much in Seth's farewell to the art world, in a way of sort of saying, I mean, I can analyze these politics. I'm interested in analyzing the politics of art. And he even says in a letter from the time, I'm more interested in the politics of art than in the art itself. So this kind of move into thinking about how art circulates, how value is created, how value circulates in art, does very quickly lead into his work in the early 70s and through the 70s into the early 80s, in his interests in Marxist theory, theories of communication, and the research center that he establishes, which is the International Mass Media Research Center. That was a few answers at once, but yes, I mean, these things do become very linked, and I think in this idea of this area of political activity and organizing and ideas just became more interesting and more of I think fruitful space at the time for him.
Lucy, what's your memory of that time, the early 70s?
Yes, it was a complicated time. Were we going to talk about Seth's frame thing, the role of the frame, or do you want me to talk about that?
We talked about it, yeah, a little bit. Please go ahead.
Well, anyway, the 70s were, I mean, as Seth says in his interview with Joe Melvin, which is always interesting to me because it's him looking back on that period. We always had our own directions, and of course, feminism was very much mine. And by 1970. Originally, we met through the Art Workers Coalition and the work, and I gather you've already discussed that.
No.
Well, I mean, I came back from Argentina where I got revolutionized by Argentine artists who said, we're not making art when the world is such a mess, and Argentina was a mess, and we were a mess. And so I went back and immediately fell into the arms of the Art Workers Coalition, which wasn't formed actually till January 69, and I think that was when Seth and I met, but maybe in the fall around similar stuff. I mean, frankly, I just don't remember. But so my direct, and then that was 69. Then in 1970, I lived in Spain for a few months and came back to fall into feminism. And Seth was in Paris then. When I went to Spain with my son for a few months, we saw Seth in Paris for a little while. So I don't know the chronology of all of that, but then I was poured into feminism, and I hope we haven't already discussed feminism and Seth, because I've got a few comments on that. But,
Oh.
We will definitely talk about that.
well, it wasn't just Seth. The man I lived with after Seth had a lot of trouble with feminism too. I don't know what's wrong with you guys, but anyway. And the role of the frame, I was interested when I read that in the book. I had never seen that or heard of it, but it struck me as very art historical for Seth. I didn't see it as an escape from anything. Maybe I read it fast and I may not remember enough of it, but he really was talking about context, which was so important for conceptual art. And of course, that was really where the 2 years before feminism was all about conceptual art. And I don't know if you've gone into that part yet, but I don't know. What else do you want to? I'm really discombobulated from
okay. I hope you had a glass of water, Lucy. And
would be a good idea, but I didn't get it.
One thing, just very fast thing I want to say about the role of the frame text, just for listeners. It's written in 1968 when Seth is organizing an exhibition at Wyndham College, which is referred to as the outdoor exhibition. And it's Carl Andre and Robert Barry and Lawrence Weiner, and Seth recalls it, and even in that text in a way, I certainly talks about it as a moment of moving away from a kind of reliance on like physical things in space needing to last and be installed. And there's a sort of story about Lawrence Weiner's work, which was all it was basically like a grid of twine and wooden stakes in the ground. The students kept running through and destroying.
Yes.
So the idea is like, well, I had the idea for the work, and I guess the idea is good enough as if it had really been there. So this movement shift to think about like the context in which things are placed really moves to the fore as a way of working.
But of course, in the meantime, the earthworks guys were also doing stuff, and women who weren't being paid any attention to. But so this whole business of being out or making a different context outdoors was certainly, Seth didn't hang in with that long. I don't think that earthworks stuff interested him at all. But
so let's we'll have to talk about the contract, and we'll have to talk about the female artists and the absence of female artists in Seth's exhibitions too. But just before we do that, I'd like to continue on his trajectory and talk about his work on textiles, because his magnum opus really was the publication of the Bibliographia Textilia Historiae, which is a general bibliography on the history of textiles. And I wondered, Marja, if you could talk a little bit about this project and whether you see a direct line between his work in conceptual art and then his activity with the political activity, because he was very much involved, interested in the aspect of labor and of community that's part of the textile production. And do you find that in textile he found sort of the paramount Marxist art form in a sense?
Yes, I would think so. I mean, of course, textiles has a lot of things in it, like he liked the beauty of it. It's easy. And when he had his gallery, he already was interested in textiles. But in the textile industry is like the first place where you have all these social revolutions and industrialization. And he was very interested in the economic part of the textile history. And that, of course, connects very much to Marxism. Like if you think about a medieval system of guilds, it's really what Marx based a lot of his theories on. And so Seth particularly interested in that aspect of the textile history. And so he collected these books, but yeah, from one thing always comes the other, because he never had his eyes closed or just focused on one thing only. No, if he saw something related which opened up a new path or another approach, he would immediately jump on it. And if you look at the textile history, there's of course all the classical literature about all the different techniques and things, but there's a large part of it about the economic and historical developments. And that for him was really important. Like he would talk about Piren as much as about all those Germans in the beginning of the 20th century in Berlin who published a lot on textiles, like Julius von Schlosser and so, but there's so many names. So this bibliography is indeed very broad, and so is his library. And that makes it also one of the reasons why it's difficult to find a good place for him, because I talk to museums and institutions and they always like one aspect, but are not very many people who are interested in this broadness, which I think is one of his great qualities, because to be able to connect the thinking of conceptual art, which basically is quite political, then to the position of the artist, and then sort of think, yes, but those medieval workers in textiles were artists in their own right. So for him, it was all like connected.
Mm-hmm. I heard a great talk by Sarah Martinetti describing the way he collected all these books and processed them and created a bibliography, and then the books had to be carted off to a storage space because they were piling up and piling up and piling up. And so I find that so interesting, the idea that there's this huge processing of information that happens, with sort of a chain and at the same time, a fascination with the object itself, which is the textile, for its tactile qualities, its visual qualities, and so on. Okay, well, let's talk about the contract, the famous Siegelaub-Projansky contract. You published in the book a draft manuscript that was created in preparation for the contract, and I found it very helpful because it really shows what Siegelaub was trying to do, what he was trying to achieve, which is a way for artists to retain control over their creation after the event of the sale of the work, in a sense that they continue to be bound up morally, creatively, and economically, especially, with their work, even if there is a transfer of ownership. That the transfer of ownership doesn't simply make all of this evaporate into thin air. So Lauren, could you talk a little more about this contract, how it was elaborated, and maybe how its use, and whether it failed, whether it didn't achieve, whether it achieved or didn't achieve what it was trying to do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, this question of failure is kind of the perennial sort of word that floats around it. I think for me, it's more of a question of like, what was the goal? to maybe reassess that question. But so the contract really did grow out of the activism among the Art Workers Coalition, another activity at the time. And Lucy, I'd love for you to chime in on this too. And was not the only, I think it's also important to note, it certainly was not the only contract like this that existed at the time. Ed Kienholz had developed a contract before this. There was an Art Workers Coalition draft contract that had very, very similar terms. Actually, they both had very similar terms. But it really was a way, as kind of Seth sought to sort of concretize and come up with some sort of a solution for all of these rights that artists wanted in their work, and to develop a clear and actually usable contract for those rights to kind of be solidified. And so the contract itself aims to be, it's a very kind of catch-all agreement. It has everything from a resale royalty, most famously, artists get 15% of the accrued value on resale. It has moral rights clauses protecting artists from their work being damaged or destroyed. It requires artists to give their permission for an exhibition, and so on. And the way that it works is that every future collector has to sign it. So it travels with the life of the work. One thing that's interesting to know, I think, about the draft is that there was one extra clause which allowed artists to choose what jurisdiction they wanted disputes to be resolved in. I don't really understand why this was taken out, but I think that it had something to do with Seth's real interest in this being a universal document in some way. Oh no, I'm sorry, I take that back. It had a US. It was specified for the US more in the beginning, and then he took that out with the idea of it being kind of more international and universal. And so had it translated in German, Italian, and French, and so on, and really wanted it to be taken up for wide use, to become a standard in the field. Of course, it never became a standard in the field, but at the same time, it has been modified by many artists subsequently and is reproduced endlessly. Lucy, I believe you even reproduced it in an essay that you wrote for you did. It was a long time ago. But yes, and then as we saw, it's part of the Pad D archive now too. But so as an idea, as a set of principles around like how artists' ongoing relationships with their work should be and their work to collectors should be, in that sense, it has been.
I found it very interesting that Seth's pragmatism kind of surfaced in the contract, because he didn't have much patience, as we know, with art world stuff and so on, but he cared about artists, and so the pragmatism in the contract was really very important. And Paula Cooper reminded me that that Hans Haacke and Jackie Winsor are the only two who are still using the contract, which is interesting because it scared artists. Like, oh my God, I'm not going to make a sale. I mean, art world pressures were very high, and I truly admire Hans and Jackie for keeping it up. One funny thing, this probably doesn't have much to do with this, but when I gave some money to Vets for Peace recently, a couple of years ago, and I got a thank you note from Bob Projansky, who was the treasurer of Vets for Peace in California. That was kind of a nice tie-in. And I also thought about Seth's contribution to the AWC hearing in, I guess, '69, where he said, kind of was warning people, pay attention to the demands, really look at what you're demanding. And of course, we weren't doing much of that. We were mostly just madly demanding. So, again, his pragmatism brought us back to where we should be. If we really wanted to make a difference, this happened frequently, that we should really be careful of what we were up to.
We should back up a little bit and just say that the contract is basically, just to explain to our listeners, when you purchased as a collector or as an institution, when you purchased a work by an artist who was using this contract, you had to agree to contact the artist every time the work was exhibited, every time the work was loaned. And if there was going to be a transfer of ownership, that is, if you were going to resell the work, you had to give 15% of the profit to the artist. And then, and it's that in that sense that I was saying that the artwork, the artist continues to be involved with the artwork after the simple event of the sale. And for most museums, this has not been a problem. Because museums are used to asking the artist or informing the artist prior to an exhibition or to a loan, and by and large do not sell the work that they own.
But can I point out one thing that the Museum of Modern, the reason the Art Workers Coalition started was because Takis was not allowed to choose the piece in the show that we protested and started the Art Workers Coalition. So museums were not always that nice, and I'm not so sure they are now.
That's good to know, yeah. And collectors, for collectors, it's another matter. And that's, I guess, where the fear artists fear that this would inhibit their sales comes in, because collectors would have to be convinced in a way of the usefulness of the contract, and sort of were very reluctant to commit to all the provisions in the contract.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So maybe let's move on to the topic that we were talking about earlier, which is, if you look at list of artists in Seth's exhibitions, one thing that strikes you right away is the absence of female artists, or how rare they were. There were some. Hannah Darboven shows up, Christine Kozlov shows up, but by and large, it's a very masculine world. And so, Lucy, I'm dying to ask you, what were the conversations that you had with Seth about that topic?
I don't remember conversations per se, and of course, Seth, his politics were good. He was sympathetic, but I mean, this was the beginning of men having to really think about this, and he was right in the crowd of not thinking enough about it, I think. But we never had any fights about it or anything, but when he did the Halifax conference, that was all men, and that was when I registered a protest, a public protest, and so on. I don't remember it ruining our lives, but you know, he knew exactly where I was coming from. But then I saw the Studio International issue, and the people I chose, that was all men. So I can't throw the first stone.
Joe, what do you think he was a universalist who didn't really have any interest in identity politics, such as gender or race?
That's an interesting question. I wouldn't say he didn't have any interest, but it wasn't the motivating factor. I mean, there are many anecdotal stories of, and I'm sure Lucy will recall, when an artist, for example, Christine Kozlov, was being invited to be part of an exhibition and being asked to participate, and was actually withdrawing from that idea of participation, probably in part due to its overemphasis on a machismo presence and on a kind of specific way of thinking about the identification with one's work and what indeed one's work was, so that she would slip away, and then the work would be about that notion of not being pinned down, being slipping away, being elusive, being negated. And I think that as a form of very strong protest was something that certainly Seth was fundamentally interested in, but how, to say whether that was a sort of conscious thing about the presence of women being the same as the presence of men or such in exhibitions would be misleading. But I don't think there was a conscious exclusion at all. I mean, there were many women artists with whom Seth worked later. For example, Maria Eichhorn, with all the work that she did around the contract, which is extremely fundamentally important. And as you've mentioned, with Jackie Winsor being part of that, and a number of the artists and collaborators with whom Maria connected are women, and they were through the kinds of networks of Seth, and many of the people who were working with him were women. I mean, you'll see that the panel, the editorial panel is exclusively women. Well, there was another advisor who wasn't a woman, but it is predominantly women. So, it is a question, and it is certainly something that I asked Seth about, and many others. I mean, Peter Townsend. What is this emphasis? And the answer, I wasn't actually present at that time, but the answer is, well, it was the men that were obviously there. So, there's the ambiguity and there's the rub, because clearly the women were there, but how were they there?
I did, eventually, I think in 1974, the last of my numbers shows was women conceptual artists, because people kept saying, sort of what you're saying, and I was also aware of that it was mostly men. I mean, you know, it was hard to get away from that cadre of that central batch of conceptual and minimal artists.
Mhm.
And so that's why I finally, and then of course the women were out there as usual. When you start looking for women in 1970, you really had to look. And suddenly everybody was popping out of the woodwork and doing really interesting work. And so by the time by 1974, which was well into all of this, I did this one show, and I had conceptual artists from Europe and from, I think, Latin America and the US and so forth. So, and they were there working away. And I don't know how much that show, it traveled. So it did get a certain amount of traction.
It certainly had a lot of press at the time amongst a circle, and those people were producing work throughout the period. It was just that, you know, like with the Kozlov, it was on the edge, and that on the edge then becomes part of the production of the work itself.
Yeah, I was stunned to find out that the secretary to whom those instructions are addressed for the January show was Adrienne Piper, for example. She was there too.
Yes.
So, and we should note also another exhibition called Double Consciousness, Black Conceptual Artists, which was curated by Valerie Cassell in 2005, I believe. Sort of also, you know, excavating that history too, which is an interesting addition to the conversation. I guess we'll open, we have a little bit of time left, so we'll open to questions from the audience. And I have one question from Champy, who asks, I'm wondering about Seth's intersection with Fluxus. Seth's role that he created reminds me somewhat of Machunas. Was there any overlap there, or with Ray Johnson and mail art?
I certainly don't know of any, but that, you know, I didn't know everything Seth was up to, because we did have these separate channels in which we worked and so on. I never saw Fluxus as being the least bit political, but Fluxus saw itself as being political. So you know, Seth interacted with a lot of people. So I don't know if he had anything to do with McCunis or not, but.
Joe or Lauren, do you have any?
Well, you want to go ahead, Jeff? No, I'm just going to say that I think it's actually interesting that there isn't more crossover. But one thing that I would note with Machunas that I was just thinking of is I'm remembering this great, very small exhibition of Macunas's copyright registrations. This was maybe like 5 years ago or something like this, that just sort of highlighted how he actually like registered a lot of the works of other Fluxus artists under the umbrella Fluxus, which was, you know, Machunas. And there were, and Seth actually took out, and so the Xerox book, you know, is copyrighted under Seth and Jack Wendler's name. That was the only book Seth ever took a formal copyright out in for the conceptual art years. But in the March show, he and Flanagan have this very funny exchange about Seth saying that all of the works will be property of Seth Siegelaub. So anyway, it just sort of highlights these sort of different ways of treating the relationship of this, you know, the kind of organizer to the artists that they're working with and promoting in a way. And I don't know, maybe Seth was sort of more aware of those tensions, or kind of didn't want to have that same kind of level of control over things. You know?
I think there was also a sort of one level of, for myself, I can't speak for Seth, but a level of thinking that Fluxus was not hard and clear enough, not political enough, and so forth. I sort of ignored Fluxus, I have to say, for many years. They just sent me a whole bunch of books from Celio Press, which were wonderful, and it brought back a lot of memories and so on. I realized I was more aware of Fluxus than I apparently was saying in public, but it was a very different trajectory, and so much more involved with literature and poetry than we ever were. I mean, poetry, conceptual artists did not want to be called poets.
Okay, Jason asks, as we move more towards digital documents and databases in a real life dematerialization of the information that is central to our day-to-day lives, what do the panelists think is the legacy of the bureaucratic office paper aesthetic that infuses much of the conceptual art, or at least its documentation, championed by Seth Siegelaub? What is the legacy of that aesthetic?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
Because its premise kind of demands, in a way, a shift in aesthetics and a shift in how we perceive and a shift in our consciousness or concept or grasp of what is material. And I think that fundamental connectivity, which is something so central to Seth's practice, is something that he would be particularly want to engage with, how that thread, how that trajectory manifests itself through the digital form. So how can we actually engage in a way that has that kind of excitement of the literal touch of the cover of the book, of this book that's out with the hard, card, with something that isn't hard or card, but in front of us on the screen and moving. And I think that how I would see any kind of engagement with Fluxus would be through a sort of collaging of things from different sources that come together, cut out in different ways, and somehow by being cut out in different ways are put within, to go back to that first question of yours, put within this notion of the parameter. So that the parameter of the net becomes so slippery that it's a paradoxical question that we can't actually get to the bottom of. But I think it's something that has a fundamental connection to Seth's way of thinking.
Patrick asks, was there anything you found as you put together this collection that particularly surprised you, or a work you were especially excited to be able to include in the book?
I think a lot of the interviews are really nice and are included here for the first time. So actually that one, I think that's the airline variant one, is the one that you quoted from, that's included here for the very first time. And that's a great interview that Seth did in early summer 1969. So he's like right in the middle of embarking on all of these projects and is really sort of reflecting on how they're being received, but also you can tell in his words, sort of figuring out how to explain what he's doing too, which is a lovely moment. Or like an interview with Claire Spark in Los Angeles about the artist contract, which he did as a radio show to promote it. It was almost impossible to copy edit it because he just talks so fast and so hurriedly and so excitedly that it's just like, we're very, very run on. Yeah.
One of the things that was in the book that I hadn't read for many, many years was Patsy Norvell's interview, which I guess I edited because it read very well. I mean, it read a little better than some of the interviews, which are really hard to figure out what's going on and so on. But I think Patsy has since passed away and was a close friend of mine, and she did a very good job, and she stood up to him and asked good questions, and I thought that was a wonderful interview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and 1 week after the Art Workers Coalition open hearing, actually, is when that interview took place. Yeah. So his reflections on that event are so fresh in the interview. Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah.
Maybe a final question, because this one sort of opens up to to the future in a sense. Do you think anyone working today has taken up the baton, so to speak, on Siegelaub's work?
There'll never be another Seth.
The foundation continues its work.
Yes, and there are many artists who take like a small part and continue with it. I mean, I can name some like that, Jonathan Monk, Marja Eichhorn. So what I think is it says is a source for many artists, but they can just, it's endless. So everybody picks a little bit and continues.
Yeah.
Yeah, and with such a diverse sort of set of interests too. There's so many entry points also, and opportunities for surprising crossover too, which is really, I think, like so generative and generous about the work as a whole.
You actually could see it when we made the exhibition in the Stedelijk Museum, which then was a sort of survey of everything he did in his life. I have had reactions from so many different sides and people I'd never heard of, but like some people like the conceptual, some were interested in political publishing, some were interested in the book collecting, the textile collecting, the idea that as say colonial arts, maybe the word now, was really integrated as part of a textile tradition, which is actually a big problem for museums at the moment, because they still think in terms of that, yeah, a tapa comes from the South Sea, so that's not really a drawing. And indeed it is a drawing. It's only not on normal paper, but on the bark of a tree. It doesn't mean that it hasn't to do with drawings. And so there are many things like that. And I was surprised that there were so many diverse reactions in a broad spectrum.
Well, I think this is a wonderful place to end. It gives us a lot of food for thought. And I want to thank you all for joining us and for speaking about this beautiful book. As I said earlier, I think it's really going to be an invaluable resource for the study of that period and for Seth's legacy. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Anthony Allen, Marja Bloem, Lauren Van Haaften-Schick, Lucy Lippard, and Joe Melvin for that wonderful conversation. Like Anthony said, so much to chew on and think about. And this book, you just kind of want to spend the rest of your life in it. We are currently closed at the bookstore for some small renovations. So if you want to arrange to pick up the book when we reopen, just send us an email. You can send it to me or to info@192books.com. You can also order from the bookshop.org page. There's a link below right on this page, and they will ship it to you as soon as they get it back. This event will be posted right after it ends, and the recording will be available. So send it to a friend, or if you missed the beginning, you'll be able to watch it again. And all our past events are also available. So check those out, 192books.com. There's a link to all of them. A good thing for a snowy, cold day like today. Next event is Thursday, February 4th at 6 p.m. We're going to be discussing Sergei Lebedev's new novel, Untraceable, from New Vessel Press. So do not miss that. That is February 4th, 6 p.m. And thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a lovely rest of your day.